Hello and welcome back to Critical Thinking. Hopefully everyone has had a good restful break for the last week and ready to jump into Module 8, Writing to Analyze. A lot of material here, so I've divided it up into two parts, parts 1 and 2. There's part 2, of course, next week. A lot of this stuff we've already talked about because it really refers to the way in which we speak to people. We use facts, inferences, and judgments all the time when we write and we speak, because we typically are speaking with a reason. We should. And that reason is we have a belief that we wish to impart upon someone else. So when we speak and when we write, we present our beliefs, and we wish to present it in such a way that it is not only factual, but it is backed up with claims that can be proved. Of course, that's what a fact is. But we certainly can be allowed to use inferences. We can make judgments based on those facts. But generally speaking, this is the way that people speak. So let's make sure that we're clear on what it is that we're talking about here, because really this sounds like what we've talked about now a couple of times, and it's true. But it is a really important component of critical thinking. The ability to be able to divide up these various statements and say, those are facts, those are inferences, and those are judgments. So let's take a look at something very simple. If you're like me, I take the bus, or used to, up until, it's March the 8th. So in less than a week, it's going to be 1 year since I've not had to take a bus to Fanshawe. But let's look at the difference between these three types of statements. The first is the fact. My bus was late today. Okay, I can prove that by saying, well, it should have been here at 10:30. It was 10:48, still hadn't arrived. That's somewhat factual. So my bus was late today. That's a fact. Now, if you say, well, given what's going on, or after today, my bus is probably going to be late tomorrow. So you're making an inference based on a fact. Today the bus was late. Tomorrow the bus is likely to be late. Or, more or less based on what I know, it's likely going to happen. That's an inference. But you're still using facts to come up or generate this particular statement. And in the last one, based on the fact that the bus is late or was late today, your inference may kind of collapse or segue into a judgment. Just because the bus was late today, somehow the bus system's unreliable. Now, if you were going to pass a judgment like that, you would have to back it up with a whole range of other things, other verifiable statements, other factual statements. I've heard other people say the same thing. Half the buses that we have during the week are never available on the weekends, or especially Sundays, etc., etc. Those are factual statements, but together they allow you to make a judgment. The bus system is unreliable. So typically in class, what I do is I show these three statements, and together we try to figure out what kind of statement it is. Is it factual, inferential, judgmental? Should be pretty straightforward. First one, each modern nuclear warhead has over 100 times explosive force or explosive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima or Hiroshima. Number two, with all the billions of planets in the universe, the odds are that there may be other forms of life in the cosmos. And three, in the long run, the energy needs of the world will best be met by solar energy technology rather than nuclear energy or fossil fuels. Okay, so we look at those three. They're quite different. It's not the same as the bus issue. But the first statement is factual. It represents facts about the world that can be verified. So when we're describing the world in that way, that it is something that we can verify, we are talking and using factual information. So the first statement is factual. The second one, it provides information that could be verifiable. We're not sure. But it cannot be verified in any consistent way. That's where the distinction is between a fact and an inference. And an inference, if you look hard enough, you could find some factual information to back it up, but it is still an inference. I think this. So the conditions could be met using facts, but they go beyond the fact. They use the facts to make a further statement. But that further statement, you could say, the worst case inference would be what we've called a slippery slope. We know those things very well, but it is still an inference because it is something that is not currently known. We don't know for sure at this time that the future will be exist in the following way. And then the third one is applying certain standards to make a situation unreliable or the opposite, more promising. You're basing your judgment, opinion, there's a fair amount of overlap there, when you're describing the world in ways that evaluate it on the basis of certain criteria. So if you just go back for a second to the previous comments here, the first one, factual. Each nuclear warhead has over 100 times explosive power. That's factual. 2, for the billions of planets, the odds are, right, it is likely that there may be other forms of life. And the third one, a judgment, in the long run, so we're talking could be 10, 20, 30 years into the future, the energy needs of the world. Now, that's not really a slippery slope. It's kind of a positive. It's maybe going uphill rather than downhill. But in the long run, the third statement is a judgment because we are basing the conditions we're under now and looking to the future and saying, well, based on this, my judgment is that this issue we're having with energy needs are probably going to be best met using solar or nuclear energy. Solar energy rather than nuclear. So each of those, fact, inference, or judgment. Okay, that's really kind of the way we think about the world. We're using these kinds of statements to describe and organize the world. A lot of it has to do with things that we have not experienced directly. And so we make inferences and we make judgments based on, well, given everything we need, everything we could know about the world, we know actually very little. Socrates, the ancient Athenian philosopher, stressed over and over again, if I know anything, it's the fact that I know nothing, right? He, I think on his deathbed, ended up saying that. But what he's meant, what he's trying to say here is that we do organize and describe the world in certain ways, but we should be mindful of the way in which we do it. Do we do it using facts or inferences or judgments? So if we can point that out to others, certainly to ourselves, we may not even be aware that we're making those kinds of statements. Now, that's not to say that we're ignorant or we're speaking blindly. It's good to know that we can identify these different types, these facts, inferences, and judgments, because if that is the case, we can then turn around and describe the world more carefully, we'll say. It's not that we can't. We just try to do it using factual information. That's really kind of the long and the short of it. So when we are talking, when we are writing a report, whether it's a case study in class, writing an essay, those kinds of different statements become very important because how often have you received an essay back from the instructor, with a question mark circled, and because you've made what appears to be a factual statement and you haven't backed it up with anything, and they're like, "What? Okay, so you present this as a fact. Where's the backup? Like, you need to back up this statement." That's really essentially what is going on. So we don't use all of our senses, to check out everything that's going on in the world. It's impossible. It would be overwhelming, but we certainly can learn a fair amount about the world around us. That's not impossible. What we need to do is to make sure we know what kind of statements we're making about the world. So we can talk about factual statements. There are things that we can simply assume because we've heard it so many times. Several examples here. The Great Wall of China is more than 1,500 miles long. Well, it's more than, so we know that it travels the entire length of a border. It's very, very long. Somebody may have been able to measure it using, I'm sure, satellite imagery or something. But it's something we simply assume. We just assume that is correct. Large mountains and craters on the moon. Now, of course, everyone's their interests are on Mars. And again, the conspiracy kooks are having a field day because, oh my God, there's, ancient civilizations and the remnants of giant forts and castles, and okay, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and so are castles. So anyway, the point is there are things in the world that we can agree are correct, even if we don't have factual proof ourselves. I haven't been to China, nor have I been to the moon, nor have I sort of walked up to somebody with a microscope and looked at their skin to find that it's covered in germs. But it's something that I know sounds reasonable right? That's really kind of what it comes down to. It sounds reasonable. So we consider these factual statements because even though we can't verify them in our senses, we do know that if we were given the opportunity to go to China or to go elsewhere, to go to the moon or to be shrunk down to the point where we could actually see germs on a person's skin, we could then verify these statements that are otherwise considered facts. Really, at the end of the day, if someone else has experienced it and we trust that source, then we can say that those statements are factual because these people have either gone to the moon, or they at least know enough about the moon, or they've gone to China, or whatever it may be, or they're physicians, and they can tell us, right? They can say, yeah, based on my experience, this is true. This is in fact correct. So typically, when we write, as much as possible, we wish to communicate information, right? That belief system that we have, using factual reports, because that is the way in which we can back up any kind of statement that we make about the world. Because once we do that, then we can begin to interpret the world. We can infer certain things from these factual statements. And then finally, we can evaluate our inferences or evaluate our facts. We can judge them. But it is kind of a scaffolded way of thinking about the world. But at the bottom of it, the foundation should always be factual information. And that is ultimately how we speak to each other. So factual reports, whether it is, even if it's an essay on a poem that you may have written in English class, that's no different than a case study on the code book that you all study. Because both of them are documents that you can look at and you glean information from them and you can identify facts. You can certainly, with a poem, identify inferences and judgments. Maybe not so much in the code book, but certainly you can base an inference or a judgment of the code book based on all of the facts that are presented. And really those laws, those codes, are very factual. They're very likely based on a series of either experiments or experience by fire prevention people that say, look, aluminum wiring maybe is not as good as copper wiring, or a certain kind of breaker box should be the minimum requirement if you have an air conditioner. Otherwise, you may overload the thing and it could blow up, right? These end up being codes and laws that become part of the what's in your code book because it's based on facts that people have experienced. Maybe not you yourself, but they have been experienced by others, and those people are the ones that end up creating the code book in the first place. So even though this sounds like it's fine, it could be problematic because we've seen that our perceptions and our observations may not be completely accurate. Have you ever played the game in probably, I would think, public school, for now in college, where you line up 10 students and the student at one end whispers something into the ear of the one next to them, and they do the same thing. So the person at the one end listens to what comes out at the other end. If it's even remotely close, you've done a good job. Quite often it gets all distorted, and the next thing you know, I didn't say that. And that there's 10 people in the same room in real time doing it. So our senses cannot always be trusted. We should like to be able to reproduce some kind of hypothetical situation and be able to prove it consistently that the same thing will happen over and over again. That's really what you want to do. But our senses sometimes can be very deceptive. So when we think we're making a factual report, we could be making sort of incomplete or inaccurate statements. We need to make sure that what we say is not only clear and is factual, but is also backed up. A good example, this is my report here. I'm just going to hold it up for a moment. And this is the report I received from the editor, the publisher that I'm working with that will be publishing my book, hopefully later this summer. And all the way through, it's okay, just... he says, okay, there's connections with the SI often drawn by way to a reference, but we're not given much way of substantial discussion. What do we learn from drawing these links? And then another part there, what more can we say as it relates to this particular idea? So they want clarity. Even though I'm reporting what I think are factual statements, this editor or this reader says, well, you're making some assumptions, right? You're making some inferences. We need some facts. We need to link these ideas together more clearly. Same sort of thing. And I've been writing since 1975, my first published thing. So a very long time. And it's still a learning process. And we do make what we think are factual statements when in fact they might be incomplete. And there are some things here that simply, it might pass. It's still okay. But this is the book, right? You got to step up your game when you write a book. So it's got to be very, very good. So yeah, they could be nitpicking, but so what? If it makes me look better, no problem. I'll fix that in no time. So what I'm getting at here is when we are speaking factually, we need to make sure that everything, all the, every I's dotted, every T's crossed, and all the rest of it. Because when we're getting to the point of direct observation, all right, what we think is occurring in the world really is based on beliefs about how the world operates that we simply are assuming on behalf of other people. I mean, on behalf of ourselves, but we are now basing what we think is happening in the world on what other people have said and have done. So let's say a simple statement like humans can't fly. Sure, okay, we can't fly, but we can fly in airplanes, fly in helicopters. We can fly in these crazy suits here, although I personally wouldn't want to do it. Looks pretty wild, but it's a flying suit. So when we say humans can't fly, that's partially right. But we have to make all kinds of exceptions, right? With the exception of everything I've just mentioned. And yet it's allegedly a factual statement. So increased knowledge and understanding have shown that factual beliefs can be inaccurate and replaced by better beliefs, clearer beliefs that explain the world in more accurate and predictable ways. So this is, for example, the one I just showed you with the reader. Make it clear. It may be clear in your mind, but make it clear to the reader why you want to talk about this person or this book in relation to that book or that person, and make that connection clear. So they become kind of factual beliefs. I'm sure people would make the connection. Well, that depends on who the audience is, right? Are they in the know completely? At which point, why you're writing this book? If they know. If they don't, and you stumble into something new, have at it, right? Go ahead and make it a better belief. Show people why this is something that's worth thinking about. So conclusions can be drawn from factual information that may be reasonable, but maybe it's not factual, right? It kind of makes sense that if I step on the sun, it's probably really, really hot. Haven't been there, don't know of anyone that has gone there, but I'm going to make the assumption that the sun is a very hot place. So is it factual? Sure. Is it a belief? Yes, because I am inferring that this ball of flame that's how many times the size of the earth is really stinking hot. So in terms of beliefs, that's really more of an inference, right? Because I'm basing it not on something that I can directly experience. I hope nobody ever does, right? Because it's going to last about 1 second, you'll be gone. But something like that is more of an inference, right? The sun is hot. No one has gone there. We're just making an assumption because of what the sun does, right? Its particular qualities. The sun is a hot place. So it is still an inference because we don't have the factual evidence. We haven't had someone hold a thermometer next to the sun going, look at that. Oh, it is hot. Oh, in fact, the thermometer just blew up. So these kinds of things we need to be able to distinguish, right? It's a factual fact rather than a factual belief. And certain things, even though we're talking about a factual belief, it doesn't mean that they're really kind of wacky. They do still make sense. Like factual beliefs can be verified by direct observation if you could, right? If you could land on the sun for a nanosecond. But inferential beliefs, right? They go beyond what we directly observe. And we can make inferences about things quite often because we're basing it on some degree of fact, right? We are basing our inference. We're inferring if this is the case, then probably that is the case. That's really, the if-then structure. That's really what it is. But we need to be able to make a distinction between those two types. Now, this is something, hopefully we can get to it. I'm going to click on it right here, and I'm probably going to have to move this. How will you see it? Okay, so let's move this over to here, scroll down. Parents spreading the fear to their kids over the Momo challenge. I don't know if you remember this, but this whole thing was a hoax. this, the Momo challenge, we'll call it that. This is 2019. So this scary looking thing was apparently something that everybody was seeing. And yet nobody could ever prove that, I saw it here. I saw it on this video. But it just started. And it went like wildfire. So Momo challenge believed to be a hoax. Said YouTube, we have no recent evidence of videos promoting the Momo challenge circulating on its platforms. So this is something that at the time was as good as true. Oh my God, I've seen it and for sure. But when push came to shove, nobody had actually seen it. So that can happen. So I just wanted just a quick example that's from about a year ago. But it is important because things that we think are happening, once we try to find that factual evidence, a little bit more difficult. So we're making such inferences. We're able to see the world as a complete picture. So in other words, we're filling in the blanks, right? We have factual knowledge of many things, and over our lifetime, we will learn many, many more things. But because we're able to do that, we can kind of fill in the blanks. If this is so, I believe that is likely to happen, right? The word likely is correct. It's not a long shot. It's not jumping from one sort of inane fact that you found because you cherry picked it amongst many others and then use that tiny thing to turn around and make a ridiculous inference. That's a conspiracy theory. That's what that is. So when we present inferences along with beliefs that we can prove, we're painting a more complete picture, right? We're filling in the blanks and making it slightly easier for someone to understand what we're talking about. Now, when we're writing and speaking, we use these particular methods of making statements from facts to inferences. They could be kind of predictions, if you want to call them that. But even predictions, right, are kinds of inferences. Because what we're doing is we're trying to figure out what is going to happen based on what we know or have experienced, and then what might likely happen. Now, in a negative way, that's a slippery slope. In a positive way, that would be an inference, right? An inference or a judgment. So if there's a coin with slippery slope on the one side, inference would be the other. An inference doesn't necessarily have to be negative. A slippery slope typically is, but an inference is still the same kind of thing. If this is occurring, then that likely will occur. But an inference seems to have a little bit more legitimacy in terms of everyday conversation because it's based on some kind of verifiable evidence. That's the main difference. So it is possible that inferences might be wrong. That is certainly true. I'm sure you've seen the Facebook meme, that jokingly say, I bet you nobody in 2015 won the contest of, hey, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Of course. And it's true. And the joke is because, no, 5 years ago, who would have thought of a pandemic? So it's jokingly referring to the idea that somebody may have inferred that in 5 years, things will be just fine. I'm still going to have my job, maybe my house or whatever, my apartment. But we could be wrong. Right? We could be wrong. There could be something we're missing or we could be ignoring that may change the outcome completely. And it becomes an incorrect inference. So it does happen. So inferential beliefs can be even more uncertain than factual beliefs because factual beliefs are based on facts, right? Inferences on inferences. If this occurs, this may likely occur as well. Now, this kind of talking typically is not important, but it becomes very, very important in certain contexts. Now, the example I have here is a courtroom, which is true, because what is observed, right? What did you see? Just tell me what you saw, right? As opposed to, well, I think the guy looked like a crook. That's an inference. That's also a judgment, but it's mostly an inference. So what was actually observed and seen by the witness versus what they think they saw, or what, could you give me a hypothesis? Can you give me, what do you think of that? Those questions would be shot down by the opposing lawyer immediately because those are inferences. They're inferential. So you want to be able to base everything that is going to either convict or release that person based on facts, based on observations. Now, in a report that you would draw up as a fire chief or an insurance adjuster, working with a fire department, especially with fires, the same sort of thing is going on. What you write down could possibly lead to, a charge of arson against someone, or reckless endangerment, or the insurance company says, look, based on our report here, the conclusion is that you knew this was faulty, you knew this was dangerous, you did nothing about it, and your house blew up. Sorry, we're not going to cover you, right? You're going to have to pay for your house with your own money. So observation versus inference in certain cases becomes very, very important. So even though on an everyday basis we may talk this way, it is very important to realize that in certain contexts, it really does matter. So we have facts, we have inferences that can be distinguished, but it is almost impossible to communicate with others in speech or writing by sticking only to factual observations. You would sound rather robotic. Your speech would not be very interesting or maybe colorful because you are basing your comments, your speech or your writing exclusively or strictly on what you have personally observed. Now, the last time anybody did that was, and I spoke a few moments ago about ancient Athens, or in Socrates, Plato. People like Plato thought that you should only base your ideas on what you have experienced. Now, 2,500 years ago, the world was, first of all, a much smaller place, because it was basically, Athens, and everything else is sort of dirt, right? Just kind of went off into the horizon. So Plato is essentially saying that, know your own immediate world very, very well, and base your opinions, your inferences, your judgments, and so on those facts. Because at that time, 2,500 years ago, you could conceivably know the entire world as it was, because there wasn't much to learn. At this point, nobody had traveled very far. I mean, they were, but surprise, they didn't know about them because the Vikings were traveling. They were traveling in developing nations, which were developing thousands of years later. The point I'm making here is, according to Plato, he knew his own world well, or he thought he knew his own world well, and made all kinds of inferences and judgments based on that. Because it was a very scientific age as well, primitive, but still scientific. And yet all these other things were going on around him that he knew nothing about. And it wasn't like he willfully ignored them. He didn't know that he didn't know, right? And that can happen. So if we were just to talk about the things we directly observe, we wouldn't have a whole lot to say. Or we would have the same thing to say over and over again, which is kind of boring. So if we were to stop and look, and many of you did really well, I was really pleased to give a lot of people 20 out of 20 for the previous assignment with the interview, because you caught these words like seems, appears, likely. Those are words that are everyday phrases, but indicate that it isn't just an observable fact, but more likely an inference. So you were able to catch these. Very good. Excellent. That's exactly what I wanted you to do. So if you can see those, you will be able to understand how language works, how ideas are presented. In the statement here, Jerry will help me with my homework when he has time. So there is some kind of a factual statement. Jerry will help me with my homework. What is inferential is when he'll be able to do it, right? When he has time. We're not sure exactly when that's going to be. Okay, so reporting, inferring, judging, right? They're all kind of woven together. And really all I asked you to do with that assignment was to take the weave apart, essentially, and identify these various strands, right? That's a fact, that's an inference, that's a judgment. And it becomes a way in which you can understand how people speak on an everyday level in terms of things that they either know for sure or they're inferring from, a sort of limited viewpoint. And it seems like some people that are willingly living in an alternate reality, we know who those people are, those folks have such a cherry-picked view of the world. And I'd love to interview a few of them after March 4th, when allegedly Trump was supposed to be sworn in as the 17th president, not the 46th, but the 17th. Wow, they're all gone, right? They've all kind of faded away into the distance. But these people hung on tenaciously to this bizarre world of some alternate reality in which, they were essentially lied to. So these people thought that they had nothing but facts, nothing but facts. Oh, the election was stolen. Well, based on what? And they refused to acknowledge that there were 65 separate court cases where this very idea was being presented. Every single time the lawyer said, no, there's no fraud here, because it is illegal for a lawyer to willingly lie in court. That's even more serious than a witness lying in court. So all of a sudden, oh, what happens in a different room, the courtroom, between what you infer and what you observe, suddenly matters. So the worldview of these QAnon people and the rest of the conspiracy nut and Trump supporters, etc., same sort of thing is happening. They're basing their factual world on inferences and judgments, and all of them are false. All of them are false. Sure, there might be a level of fraud that is negligible. I mean, 20 or 30 votes, is that going to swing a vote one way or the other? It could, but each one that mattered was where the winner was ahead by millions of votes. So I'm sorry, but it just didn't work. So when we are writing or speaking, we may be appearing to report factual information, but we want to make sure that we're not instead just expressing a personal evaluation, right? We're inferring and judging, but we're trying to pawn it off as a factual judgment. Now, this becomes really important when, for example, when you were looking a couple of weeks ago at the film review, and many of you were able to identify the facts, but a fair number of you misread inferences or judgments. The inferences, it was a fantastic movie, or the heartfelt performance. These kinds of things are really inferences. There is action on behalf of the characters. They're doing certain things. But at the same time, the way in which we interpret something, if we're interpreting, we're inferring at the same time. So there were many inferences in that movie review. And that's why I included the kind of factual report of the review, and it was very short, and I identified even the ones that could have been inferential, right? And so it can be really difficult. But things like, in my opinion, right, that is at least an identifier that the reader is about to read a statement that is an opinion, right? My evaluation is. That's one of the ways in which we can do it. We make it clear to people that the following statement is not a fact, but the opposite, an opinion. So, writers that do not identify their judgments, that's really, it's at their loss, because they may think they are presenting factual information when it is, in fact, just a judgment. So they want their judgments to be treated as facts. That's how the QAnon folks are able to work their magic. The conspiracy folks are able to work their magic as well, Flat Earth societies, the rest of them. They're trying to pass off their judgments, right? Their evaluations after critical inquiry, which means watching a couple more YouTube videos, treat everything as facts. Well, no, because that's misleading, it's fraudulent, and in certain cases, dangerous. Just think about that. 5 people died at the White House as a result of the attack on the White House on January 6th, based on lies, based on, misinformation, disinformation, people talking to them and presenting judgments of their own as facts. It matters. It really does matter. So when you confuse factual information with judgments, it can be damaging. You can internalize that, and it does happen. And that's why, I'm always willing to give people a second chance. And things like what we have here, I failed my exam today. Okay, so you failed an exam. That's a fact. But that does not necessarily mean I am a failure. No, that particular exam, for whatever reason, you failed. Could have been extra difficult. You may have studied the wrong, chapters, or not studied enough, or you could have been, filled with anxiety. I've never been a fan of exams because they fill me with a lot of anxiety, but I just kept plugging away. So you could do something like that, base a fact, or base an inference or judgment on a fact. You failed the exam. That does not make you a failure. It just means that you failed the exam. It's that simple. Okay, another way in which it can be harmful is identifying judgments, the accuracy of the statements. We need to make sure that we can do that. We know that if we're careful, we can identify beliefs, from facts, from inferences, from judgments. Ultimately, that's really what we're talking about. It's good to be able to know that that is what we can do. But we want to also make sure that we can identify it, especially in other people's statements. Because we can turn around and if we were having an argument with someone, whether it's about politics or whatever, or climate change or forest fires, to be able to stop and say, okay, hold on here, you just made, that's a judgment, that's not a fact. When somebody says, well, I think this and that, trust me, there are lots of people think that the moment they say, I think, that automatically makes it a fact. No, it makes it an inference. So if you want to knock down a person's argument, read through it carefully and look for those things. And imagine, okay, what if I were to put the little preposition, in my opinion, comma, the following? Oh, yeah, that is an opinion, right? Or that is an evaluation or interpretation or whatever. We need to always make sure that we speak factually, or we use factual beliefs to kind of fill in the blanks, but at the same time that we are able to identify what these different statements actually are. So when you're working and you're writing college papers, case studies, or even reports that you're going to write when you are out in the field, 3 things. As we are better able to distinguish among reports, inferences, and judgments, you will be able to present different types of beliefs more accurately. And really, sometimes that boils down to simply identifying what they are, right? In my opinion, it is difficult to prove this, but we should consider the following. So these kinds of things are really important because they identify what kind of statements they are. So there's at least the hope that there is less confusion. So that's the first thing. We can present these things more accurately by being aware that prepositions like, in my opinion, comma, are going to be helpful. There's a relationship between the main thesis and our beliefs about the topics, and that thesis expresses what we believe to be the main point of our paper. If you think back to our ethics course we took together, I asked you to write 2 different papers where you had a main thesis and you thought about it. And yes, I asked you to reflect on the material, but quite often a number of you went further. You found factual information to back up your inferences. Perfectly fine. Even though I said you didn't have to, some people just thought, I should go that far. That is a good rule of thumb. That is a good way to go about it because you recognize what you're doing. Yes, I asked you to reflect. Now, as I'm saying this, I don't want to think that people that did not research factual information received a lower mark. No, it's just I'm using this as an example. Some of you just feel more comfortable presenting facts to back up observations, judgments, inferences. That's a good habit to get into. And finally, the third one, we regularly use source materials for our papers. Yes, peer-reviewed, good papers. Techniques for evaluating beliefs will help us to evaluate the sources of information. If it's coming from the New England Journal of Medicine rather than, Bob's blog about medicine, likely the first one is going to be the more, the better of the two. So as we are thinking and working through and hypothesizing and looking for factual information, we're kind of doing this little graph here, right? So making an observation, we could be thinking of interesting questions that relate to those observations. We start to formulate a hypothesis, how does this phenomenon actually occur? I need to kind of test it. So from the hypothesis, I'm going to test this, right? So you start to develop a testable prediction. So the hypothesis is X, and I'm going to test it so that that hypothesis X is repeated a number of times. That now can become what you might call a formula, right? When we do this, when we apply this much heat to, butter, it melts, right? It needs to be this temperature before it begins to melt and change its consistency. So something as simple as that. So as you start testing that particular thing, you're gathering data, and you are going to more accurately test and more accurately predict. If I keep doing this over and over again, providing nothing changes, the temperature and the type of butter I'm using or whatever, you can start to develop formulas and theories about what it is that you've been trying to prove as a hypothesis. So as you're doing this, you're refining, you're altering, you're expanding, rejecting hypotheses and bringing in a better one, because the first one may not have been 100% accurate. So the tests were not the best ones, but because you were looking for the data and you went back and said, like, I'm getting different results here, so let's change something. Well, let's change the hypothesis. Let's move it in so that we are going to try to test something else. So we are doing this kind of circle of ideas: observations, questions, hypothesis, testability, predictions. And if all of that works, we can come up with an actual theory. There it is. So that's essentially it. That's the whole class. I know we've gone over this before, but it is worth knowing because it is a really accurate way to understand how we speak, how we understand the world, how we're able to define the world to others about things that we may not have even experienced, whether it's the moon or Mars or the Great Wall of China, whatever it may be. You're basing it on factual beliefs. I believe this to be true because it comes from a reliable source, right? That's the difference between a reliable source and a conspiracy theory. This comes from other people who think like me. Okay, sure. Well, welcome to the Hall of Mirrors. Good luck on that. So we need to make sure that when we're making observations, they're factual. And if they're not, we identify them as such and say, I'm inferring, right? I think, right? In my opinion, these words will make a difference because it will allow you to speak accurately, critically, and be understood accurately. Because people can make that distinction when they listen to you or read your work and know that this statement is a fact while this other statement is something else, an inference or a judgment. So there it is. We'll see each other on Thursday for the first time after the break, and hopefully we can carry on. I think I'm going to have to check right now, just kind of slipped my mind whether there's an assignment for this week. I have marked everything so far. I took a week off because I was doing my rewrites. There's my proof, my paper. But I've marked now everything. And I was really pleased with the Edward Strusek interview because many of you saw these very things that I'm talking about. That's why there's a little bit of overlap, but it's worth going over to be absolutely clear in our minds what it is that we're talking about. So speaking of talking, I'm going to stop and we'll see each other on Thursday. Take care.